It's May the 8th, 2023. We're discussing Parshat Behar, Behukotai. It's Parshiot Behar, Behukotai, double Parsha this week. But we'll focus mostly on a couple of issues within Parshat Behar, and looking at specifically the issue of slavery. I have to say the reason why I'm drawn to it is because we have a bar mitzvah this week, and our bar mitzvah boy alighted on the topic of slavery. Spent maybe a couple of sentences on it, but raises the important point, which I hope we'll get into later on, which is so the Bible seems to be permitting slavery. And so it is. The Bible does permit slavery, and why that is. So we'll have to look at that and try and examine it. Of course, we have the contextual answer. I'm going to mute one of your screens, Mom. We have the contextual answer, which is the Bible is rooted in its time period, and that is, I think, a very important answer. We have a philosophical answer, which I'll hold out and keep your suspense for, and then, as usual, try and read it critically and ask if it's at the very least satisfactory. So let's look at the text and see what's going on here in this text. The text is from chapter 25. Beginning of verse 39 in the book of Leviticus. Here we go. V'chiyamuch achicha imach. When your brother sinks down in poverty beside you, v'nim karlach, and sells himself to you, lo tavod bo avodat aved. You are not to make him serve the servitude of a serf, or in other translations, could ask. I'm going to mute everybody for a second because we're getting this. Just a second. I'm sorry. It's you. Okay. I'm going to mute everybody. When you need to speak, I'll tell you to unmute. We just got to. All right. Do not make him serve the servitude of a serf. Lo tavod bo avodat aved. And we're going to look at that in a second, what that means. Avodat aved, there's something derogatory about that. So your brother becomes poor, sells himself to you, don't work him a slave. You, as a hired hand, as a resident settler, is he to be beside you only until the year of home bringing, Shnat HaYovel, Yoavod Imach. He is to serve beside you. V'yatzame Imach, then he is to go free from beside you, he and his children beside him. He may return to his clan, and to the holding of his fathers he may return. For my servants are they, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold as the sale of serfs. Lo yimachru mimkeret aved. You are not to dominate him with crushing labor. Rather, you are to hold your God in awe. Your servant and your maid that belong to you from the nations surrounding you, from them you may purchase serf and maid. Also from the sons of the residents who sojourn beside you, from them you may purchase slaves, or from their clans that are beside you, that they beget in your land, and they shall become your holdings. You may keep them as an inheritance for your children after you, for them to possess as holdings for the ages, but you may make them serve you. You may make them serve you, but among your brothers, the children of Israel, each one toward his brother, you are not to over him with crushing labor. Okay, so we have the text there, which I'm going to bring back in a second. But even at the glance, we can see that there are a couple of concepts that are emerging for us. One, there seems to be this recognition that people will go through different cycles in their lives. They'll go through their ups and they'll go through their downs. They'll have economic moments of real despair. They won't know what to do. And because of that, they will have to take extraordinary measures. Similarly, though, if someone is in an extraordinary situation, you can't take advantage of them. That is to say, you can't enslave them the way that you would a slave. Having said that, there are people that you can enslave according to the Torah, and those are the from the people around you. In Talmudic terms, this would be called the Eved Kanaani. Eved Kanaani, the Canaanite slave. The Canaanite slave is a slave that is essentially a non-Jewish slave, a non-Jew, a Gentile. And Canaanite is the overarching term for the Gentile. And the best reason why that term is given is from the the first chapters of Genesis, where, if you recall, in the Noah story, where Shem, Ham, and Japhet, the three sons of Noah, see their father naked, and they only Shem preserves his father's dignity, but Ham is kind of he decries this, or he's derogatory about his father, and so Noah curses Ham and says that Canaan will be Canaan is the son of Ham, will be a slave to Shem. So in a sense, the Bible sees a kind of overarching justification or proof text for the enslavement of Canaan because of what Canaan did or what Ham did. I would say that it's not only because of retrojecting an immoral act to the ancestor, which is the mythological reason. There is quite a practical reason, and quite a reason that would have been self-evident to people who lived at the time in biblical Israel, who had encountered the Canaanites. They regarded their pagan practices with great disdain. They saw them as immoral. They saw them as being sexually depraved, among other things. And then once the biblical Israelites, once the Israelite tribes take dominance of the land, the Canaanites are, a minority. They still exert some kind of power, in the sense they may have some local areas. The history, is worth it to look at, but and their belief and religion may have had some kind of lure to the surrounding peoples. It takes several centuries for their paganism and for the idolatry to be rooted out. The Bible is really struggling with idolatry for quite some time already, well into the period of Joshua, Judges, and even Samuel and the Book of Kings. So it takes several centuries for idolatry to be eradicated, which only tells you that there was a tremendous allure to idolatry, probably for good reason. It was just that much more fun than the beliefs that Jews had, or our ancestors had, especially with regard to things relating to sex and the body, and probably things relating to just the immediacy of the response that is felt, and a certain set of simplicities that are deployed with idolatry, namely that you have easy explanations for all sorts of things. And so idolatry and paganism in general has a great appeal. some would argue it has an appeal to this day because we have a pagan impulse that's active and it's found in different ways. I'll stop there. We've got a question. Go ahead, Nanette. You have to unmute.
Okay. So, wait, did I unmute? Yes. So, Rabbi, I mean, should I be shocked? The whole thing sounds to me like it's all about behavior. What Hashem wants from us is behavior. You know, we don't take slaves of our own tribe. Very nice, but honestly, if we're learning to take slaves from, say, Gentiles, isn't that causing our own trouble? You know what I'm saying?
So the question is a really good question in the sense that it raises exactly this moral issue. I have to say, our bar mitzvah boy this week, raised the very same issue and said, look, how is it that, for example, with regard to the Jubilee year, the Israelite slave goes, the Hebrew slave goes free, but the Eved Canaanite, the Canaanite slave, does not go free. The Canaanite slave is kept forever, and so that's a moral problem. And you're in your question, doesn't that do us a lot of problems? Well, yeah, it does us a lot of problems if we are reading the Bible now without 2,000 or 3,000 years of mediating history and commentary. We don't live with that as the rule book for our lives right now, and certainly the Bible itself doesn't. And so what I'm going to show you, in the ensuing minutes is that the tension already exists within the Bible itself, to the point that Judaism conclusively eradicates slavery, and any hint of that. But just as an aside, we could say, and in the investigation that I did for this class, and have done it before, for other classes, but the phenomenon of slavery exists to this day. I mean, and in fact, one could argue that there are more people enslaved in one form or another in our time than there ever were in history. We don't see it in our backyard here, but human trafficking is alive and well. There are signs of human trafficking all over, including in great metropolises like New York City, where people, for example, on trains, or hotels are trained to spot things, and in fact, the whole monetary system involves certain kinds of safeguards, or not safeguards, but if you open an account and you have your bank account number and your routing number and your SWIFT number and all that, there are certain regulations around them because traffickers are using the banking system this way. And so I'm not up to date on this, but in my conversations with people who know about these things, traffickers know how to use these things very, very well. So human trafficking and human slavery exists. It exists today, and you just have to Google that, and you'll see things, mind-boggling statistics and documented stories of how slavery exists, both in the sex trade and also for other purposes. So these are quite real, and so we have to buttress the tradition here and say, well, if the Bible has a voice here that says at one point that this was permitted, then what do we do with that? Let me go, in terms of just looking at the text that I showed you, and try and offer some explanations, okay, for this, and show where the stresses are. So we're going to take a look at the first verse right now, And then a couple of things. This is for the delight in studying Torah with commentary, specifically Rashi, but also a kind of elaborate set of questions. So when you read a verse like this, verse 39, when your brother sinks down in poverty beside you, and sells himself to you, lo tavod bo avodat aved. You are not to make him serve the servitude of a serf. So I read that and I go, and putting it out by word, literal, almost, in 2 words or 3 words or 1 word, it forces me to see each phrase. It forces me to ask, well, what does it mean? What does it mean? Why is it using this word? Why is it using, for example, the word brother? What does it mean that it's your brother? And why is the text saying it's your brother? The Torah always uses, this language, like, for example, lo tisna achich et achicha bilvavecha, do not hate your brother in your heart. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Why does it say to you, do not hate your brother, but love your neighbor, right? So we are referring to people in the most intimate of terms, and that is to say, blood relations, even though it's not literally a blood relative, right? It's when your brother, that is to say, anybody who you share your ancestry with, even at the nth degree, that's your brother. That's your brother. Okay. But it also distinguishes it from those who are not part of your nation. And this is, some of the tension in this passage, because there are Israelites and there are non-Israelites. So your Israelite brother has a mechanism to work off his debt. And that is essentially what slavery, quote unquote, was in the Bible. It was indentured servitude. That is to say, I owe you, for whatever reason, $1,000. I don't have the money. What do I need to do? I need to work it off for you. So we have, for example, the indentured servitude. The story of Jacob to Lavan is indentured servitude. He's working for a reward, but he's working off 7 years to earn that. Okay, so would it be indentured servitude or just delayed salary? I'm not sure. He's working for his board and he's working for his wife. Okay, beside you, because we use the term beside you because people live together. They live literally on top of each other. He sells himself to you. So we have a story here. And the story is somebody has a hardship, and the hardship involves money, and the hardship involves economic dependency. And at one point, do you have a responsibility to put that person to work? And what point do you not want that responsibility? And so we could invent many dozens of different scenarios in which a person falls on hard times, is employable, non-employable, and what will the relationship be, and how will that person live? Will the person live inside your house? Will the person live on your estate? Will the person live in a shack on your field? And all of that. And what are the consequences of that? And what are the consequences of, food and shelter and upkeep and clothing, etc.? And what about the relationships that will ensue between the head of the household and the slave, or the head of the household and any member of the slave's family? So there are what kinds of safeguards do you have for that individual, given that individual is already at the peak of his vulnerability? Okay. You are not to make him serve the servitude of a serf. Lo ta'avod bo avodat aved. You can't make him into a slave. So we have a contradiction here. On the one hand, the person is a slave, but we're not going to make him into a slave. We know that the person is vulnerable. We know that the person has no money and the person has to work for you, but you can't treat him. So this is both a legal, it's a rule, a law, but there's also ethics here, ethics embedded in the law, which is, how are you supposed to treat someone who is A, vulnerable, and B, subservient to you in these situations? What are the implications? Okay, so I brought Rashi. Rashi is always a good person to turn to try and answer these questions. So look what he says. What does it mean, avodat aved? Avodah shel gnai. You shall not make him do degrading work, avodah shel gnai, sheyehei nikar ba ke'eved, by which he is recognized as a slave. So what does it mean? You have to have a person, everybody knows why he's in your house, but you can't treat him like a slave. So he's not a slave, so he's a servant, or he's a person who's working off a debt, and you can't give him disgracing, degrading work to do. And what are the examples? He shall not, for instance, carry his master's clothes after him to the public baths, v'lo yan'ilo min alav, nor help him put on his boots. He's not going to carry his clothes to the bath or help him put on his boots, which is fascinating, okay? Let's stop the share for a second. So we have two categories of menial work, which is, essentially, I'm his schlepper. I'm his schlepper, and I'm going to, as he goes to the bathhouse, I'm going to carry his towel. I'm going to, carry his clothes, and I'm going to take care of him at the bathhouse. And maybe there's also a euphemism here for, the bathhouse being a place where you do all your bodily duties, okay? And I do think that that's what's going on here. So, and that's menial and disgraceful to another person. And we'll see some examples in a second. The other is, you're not supposed to make him put your shoes on for you. And that seems to be self-evident, that making someone put your shoes on for you is demeaning, especially when you can do it yourself. Okay, it's another thing, and here we all have experience of personal aides and people who are, we employ to take care of us, for all of these things. They're personal. There's PAs, right? But the personal aides. But we pay them, of course, and there is a certain training that is necessary for that, a minimal training, but and there are certain codes of ethics and certain codes of understanding for them, and they become quite necessary in our lives, especially if we are not able to take care of ourselves for all the tasks. And you can imagine that there's on the one hand, there's an extraordinary, you need to be of an extraordinary character to do that. On the other hand, that may be the way that we shape our understanding of this today. Marlene, go ahead.
Two things. One, why is it that we're then allowed to do that, treat anyone else with that disdain? And B, I think there's a difference between employing someone to do a certain job, like a personal assistant, as opposed to being a slave, because you're paying and you have a different attitude and you still treat him. Doesn't the Torah in a different place say you have to give the guy the pillow first, and you have to feed him and your dogs before you feed yourself, and
Sure.
all of those other?
So you've correctly anticipated the other half of the story. And indeed, you have to treat all people with that respect. And indeed, there are people that do that work. And so there is a distinction that's made from people who do that work voluntarily and people who are doing that work because they're forced to do that work. Okay, so we don't force someone to do that work. If someone who is an employee wants to do that work, then by all means, employ them to do that. but also treat them with a certain amount of dignity. I mean, the rabbinic tradition and Judaism, of course, would have been aware, generations ago, hundreds of years ago, that not everyone could take care of themselves. In fact, look, lifespans were less, but the complexity of infirmities were maybe a little more varied. I mean, people had all sorts of crippling things. They may have not have lasted very long with a broken leg that doesn't heal, or other kinds of things. So nurses and nursing attendants and personal attendants, professional people who can care for another person, that certainly existed. But here we're talking about, I mean, I have a picture of something in my mind, which I'll show you in a second, which is, there's a certain frivolity of that, and that it makes me feel, a certain grandeur, okay? And that you're not allowed to do that to someone else. If someone chooses to do that as their profession, because they're good, they're caring, etc., that's another thing. Nobody, you're correct, should be treated with, even the person that you have clean your home, which is essentially a modern kind of evolved servant work, but one should never treat that kind of person with any indignity. And of course, today, anybody treated with that indignity is simply going to walk out on you. You're never going to get someone to work for you if you yell and scream at them and punish them. Why would they want to work for you? And certainly, there's work to be found in those areas. So we've evolved in our understanding. We've evolved in this. However, there are people that treat all sorts of people like servants. I read an article recently. If you want to judge a person's character, one of the main indicators of a person's character is how they treat a waiter or the wait staff at a restaurant. Just watch how a person interacts with someone who's there. If they have a certain graciousness, or if they're very curt and very, very demeaning to them. Look, a waiter is different from your household cleaning person, because your household cleaning person you have a relationship with, because you want them to come back to you next week or whenever you have them back. Your waiter, you just don't have to go to the restaurant anymore, and you don't have a relationship. So you can always tell someone the way they treat someone. I mean, treating, we all lived through the pandemic, and to a certain extent, these things are still with us. The way that people have altercations with flight attendants, which border on the violent now, because people can't deal with all the tension that's around that. I mean, these are different kinds of activities that people may have disdain for. Okay, I'm going to go on and point to. So Rashi gets his comment from this book called Behar, Sifra. The Sifra is a midrash. So I went and looked, what does it exactly say there? And Rashi always does this kind of trick where the early midrash from the rabbis, which preceded him by about 750 years, says one thing, and he kind of shapes it to his liking, which is what he does here. So in the Rashi comment, he says that you shouldn't do this kind of work, avodah shel ganai, right? Do not. But this is the source. You are not to make him serve the servitude of a slave. He shall not carry you in a sedan chair. Shelo yitol acharecha belontia, a sedan chair, and he shall not carry before you your clothing to the bathhouse. So the subtlety is very, very instructive here. Here, Rashi is saying, Yolik kelav acharav, the guy is walking behind you. In the Midrash, he's walking before you. Okay, I'm not sure if there's a big difference there. And the Midrash's example is carrying you in a sedan chair, enslaving you in portage. Okay, so that you are not to make your Hebrew slave carry you around. And I was wondering, well, what's behind that? And what's behind both of those things, and there's one more, with him, do not work the work of a servant, but with a free man, you may work the work of a servant. In other words, a free man, if he does so of his free will, you can, you can work him as hard as you want. I mean, the assumption is you work him with dignity, but if you're paying someone really well because they want to take you around, they want to be your caddy kind of thing, then there's nothing wrong with that. So one of the reasons why I think that there's this, the example of carrying you in a sedan is because this is how you carry around your pharaoh, and this is how you carry around your sovereign or your oligarch or whatever. And so the people who are carrying around, so they may have the dignified position as being slaves to the pharaoh. To get that job may have been a great thing, but you could see that in this hierarchy of being carried around, obviously, it can be very, very demeaning. And here's a more contemporary example, which is from the 19th century. And here it gets to be a little more interesting. So this is a picture I just found. It's Brazil. These are two Brazilian slaves. Now they're outfitted in nice uniforms, but they're slaves. And they're carrying their white matron in a sedan, okay? And interestingly enough, I mean, you can imagine that they carry her, they set it down, she gets out, and they carry and they have to wait. And it's not a great existence, for you as a slave. The caption here, a lady going on to visit, the Brazilian scholar Gilberto Fire writes, within their hammocks and palanquins, the gentry permitted themselves to be carried about by Negroes for whole days at a time, some of them traveling in this manner from one plantation to another, while others employed this mode of transport in the streets. When acquaintances met, it was the custom to draw up alongside one another and to hold a conversation. So you can see, I mean, interesting. This was common enough to see, okay, demeaning to the slave because they had to carry around their master like this. And so there is this idea that you can't have in your Hebrew slave do this to you, okay? It just makes you wonder, well, can you have your Canaanite slave do this to you? And I'm going to not be apologetic here and say, probably yes, you could do this, except for the fact that the brunt of the tradition will mitigate against that. I'm sorry. As far as the bath attendant is concerned, well, we still have bathroom attendants, and just if you dip into this, so this is a picture of somebody in some bathroom, but there was an article in the Business Insider back in November 2013. Balthazar is a fancy restaurant, and he writes, I always forget that Balthazar makes a guy stand in a tiny bathroom all day. So whenever I open the Balthazar bathroom door after breakfast, I'm hit by the same series of unpleasant emotions: annoyance, guilt, pity, uncomfortable invasion of personal space, and then extorsion. First, as I squeeze through the tiny space between the attendant and the door, I think, I forgot about this. Why on earth does Balthazar do this? Then I think, this poor guy who just had to announce my entrance into the bathroom by greeting me graciously has to stand in the bathroom all day. That's a terrible job. And now I feel like I'm contributing to making him do it. Then I think, and now this poor fellow is going to have to stand there 3 feet away from me. And he's somehow going to have to do that while not feeling degraded and uncomfortable. The poor guy is going to have to stand there and pretend not to notice. And then I think, and after that will come the worst part. I will have to walk over to the sink and watch him turn on the water for me before I get there. I will think, thanks, but I actually don't need someone to turn on the water for me. First of all, it wastes water. Second, it makes me feel like I'm the guy who dreams of being rich enough to be able to pay someone to turn on the water for me. The poor guy will talk to me while I'm washing my hands, while standing 6 inches from me. Then, after I wash my hands, he will hand me a paper towel, and then he will expect a tip. And then, at that point, I have an internal debate with myself. Should I really give him a tip for providing a service I hate, that I don't want, that takes exactly 5 seconds? Should I really encourage this annoying practice by rewarding it? Should I really support what is, in fact, extortion by guilt? Then I remember that it's not this guy's fault, that his idiot bosses make him stand in the bathroom. The poor guy's obviously doing that job because he has to do that job. I always feel bad for people who have no choice to do bad jobs, but because they have to, because I happen to be lucky enough to be able to do a job that I love. And that internal dialogue makes me think that, yes, I should tip the poor guy, even though I not only didn't want the service he provided, but actually found it invasive, embarrassing, and annoying. Okay, so that's the bathroom attendant. And that's fascinating, and I'm reacting to it because I was at a function recently, and I was kind of surprised. It was a very luxurious catered event. And lo and behold, there was this poor young kid in a uniform in the bathroom, handing out towels, doing exactly this. And I have to say, I felt the same, set of emotions, which is, God, come on, this is ridiculous. Why is he there? So I can think of one practical reason, and of course, it's the practical reason that many of you, have already considered, which is why you have, public attendance like at airports and train stations, whatever, because, lots and lots and lots of people use the facilities, and therefore they just need to be kept clean all the time. And it's for the overall functioning of an efficiency, you just need someone there almost all the time, going from place to place, bathroom to bathroom, etc. And that person needs to make sure that everything is stocked, and that's what's going on there, of course. On the other hand, to have someone in a towel, in a tuxedo with a bow tie, it may give you the sense of luxury, but it's at the expense of that person's dignity. And the fancy restaurants and the fancy catering halls and all that, it's just disdain. But go ahead, Gital. Unmute.
So we were talking, you mentioned before, you read before that you shouldn't have somebody walk behind you carrying your clothes to the bathhouse. And then there is the statement to walk in front of you and do the same thing.
Yeah.
And we know the Torah doesn't waste words. There's always a reason for everything. And to me, the reason for that is that we know that when somebody walks behind you, that's demeaning. But I think it's trying to put forth the message that even walking in front of you, doing that same kind of task, is just as demeaning.
So quite right, even though those words came from the Midrash and not the Torah itself, but I would use the same, the same interpretation, which is either before someone walking before you, is a kind of herald, and that makes you think that you are something special. Someone walking behind you, of course, is picking up after you. It makes you look special, think of yourself special in a different way. So they're both very demeaning, and they're both, details that are, disgraceful to people. Okay.
I think too many people think that if they change the environment a little bit, they're solving the problem. And this is clear that just moving the person doesn't change it.
Indeed. Good point. Okay. Let's go on. I'm just have another comment here. About the person who puts your shoes on. I think Hamanil is the person who puts your shoe on. That is an activity, this text, which I'm not going to go into, this is about idolatry. So one of the acts of idolatry, the way that people took care of their statues, a person takes care of a statue by washing it, by polishing it, by, they're worshiping it. They sacrificed before it. They poured libations out before it, and they also changed the footwear on it, hamanil. But that's different from a shoe shine person and a cobbler. Although some of those professions, the cobbler profession was always looked down upon with disdain. However, you should see the documentary about Salvatore. What's the what's his name? The famous shoes. Ferragamo. Salvatore Ferragamo, the famous shoemaker who loved shoes. And I only saw this because it was on a plane, one of these documentaries that you have to, spin through the channels, and it was interesting enough. And I mean, of course, he made a lot of money being a shoemaker to the stars, and he understood something about the foot, and he understood something about fashion in a way that most people, in antiquity did not appreciate in footwear. And so he elevated the craft from the most demeaning craft to really a very, very high craft. And it shows, because if you are going to buy a Ferragamo shoe, you'll pay $400 for a single shoe. A pair of shoes, Ferragamo's into the thousands, I think, at any rate. But so you can imagine, that the reason why Rashi chooses probably because he's influenced by this idea that putting your shoes on, putting someone else's shoes on is an act of idolatry. And let's give you one more comment here, and then we'll go into the philosophy. Ki avadaihem, this is the overriding theme. My servants are they whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They are not to be sold the sale of serfs. You are not to dominate them with crushing labor. Rather, you are to hold them in awe. This is God taking ownership, and it's the symbolic ownership. The people are mine. They belong to me. They serve me. And so here we're getting this kind of blurring of the definitions of Eved. Eved is a servant, but that's the most indignity that a person can have, is in the biblical view of the world. To be a slave is the most demeaning thing, but to be a servant of God is the most exalting thing. And so this is the play that's going on, in a passage like this. The economic hardship of an individual is not to be exploited, because the individual has a fundamental dignity as being a creature of God, and B, being someone who is a servant of God. So back to that this is a troubling picture here, okay, to be the servants of Pharaoh, but look at them. That's a very honored position. I didn't watch much of the coronation, but I imagine that there were a lot of scenes like that where, the soldiers and the people that are attending, they would have no other job but to be an attendant. Nothing gives them more dignity than to be in attendance to the king now in the royal household. Okay. All right. Let's move on to the difficulties. So the moral problems of the Bible. Does the Bible condone slavery? This is from an article. I'll read pieces of this, and then we'll go to Jonathan Sachs at the end. Many readers of the Torah are shocked and disturbed when they discover its seemingly approving references to slavery. Yes, the Torah recognizes the existence of slaves and legislates some aspect of their treatment. We even hear about a few individual slaves, Eliezer, Bilhah, Zilpah. In fact, some slaveholders in America, and even some rabbis at the time, referred to biblical laws of slavery as justification for the practice. For those of us committed both to Torah and to ending slavery, this can be a little hard to take. There are a few ways to make sense of biblical slavery. First, we need to distinguish between the Torah's two categories, Eved Knaani and Eved Ivri. The former refers to slaves who remain so for a lifetime. The latter refers to indentured servants trying to pay off a debt or raise money for their families. The Eved Ivri works for a set period of time, then goes free. With today's ethical sensibilities, it is easy to argue that we must extend the protections mandated for Jews to include all humanity. That's easy. We could simply respond that slavery was a cultural norm in the Bible's time period, which we say, but times have changed. Perhaps the Torah, with its mandated release of Jewish slaves and protection for all slaves, even improves upon usual conditions. Then he goes, Jacob Milgram goes further, suggesting that Torah actually tries to make enslaving others difficult. For Israelites, both kinds of slavery, chattel and debt, are prohibited. In other words, no Jew may own another person, and strict constraints limit how long a person may be held as an indentured servant before the debt is paid off. Okay, I'm going to move on. It is also relevant to note that later rabbis eliminated the category of Eved Ivri. Today, when the Jubilee year is not in effect, in the case of one who loses all his possessions, the Torah does not give this person permission to sell him or herself, such that he would be like a Hebrew slave, that is, that his body should be acquired by another. Rather, this person should hire himself out as a worker, and if this person has hired himself out, even though he is called a servant, he has not been acquired at all, and may quit even in the middle of the agreed-upon time, as it says, for the children of Israel are my servants. In other words, this is a person writing much later period of time, saying there's no such thing as this anymore. We can't do it. Yes, people fall in hard times, but we have an economic system that will help them if the work is there. Okay, we should remember too that Jews have always read the Torah through rabbinic interpretive lens and not simply on the plain meaning of its words. And then it goes on with a couple of other examples, and I'm going to skip to Rabbi Sachs now. Rabbi Sachs commenting on Mishpatim, on the first codification of laws of slavery, he is asking the question: look, why is this even the Torah? And you would think that this is so abhorrent that the Torah should abolish slavery altogether, and the Torah doesn't say abolish slavery. Surely it should have done. Is that not the whole point of the story thus far? Joseph's brothers sell him into slavery. He, as the Egyptian viceroy, Sofna Panech, threatens them with slavery. Generations later, when a pharaoh arises who knew not Joseph, the entire Israelite people become Egypt's slaves. Slavery, like vengeance, is a vicious circle that has no natural end. Why not then give it a supernatural end? Why did God not say there shall be no more slavery? It's a very interesting question. It really is, part of the question that we're asking, which is, it's so reprehensible. And you think, the Torah has such a moral, vein to it. Why is it even in there? Can you just excuse it by saying, this was part of the times? So what does he try to do here? The Torah has already given us an implicit answer. Change is possible in human nature, but it takes time. Time on a vast scale, centuries, even millennia. So there is a certain kind of assumption here, an acknowledgement, this is who human beings are. Human beings are cruel. Human beings subjugate each other. And you can't get human beings to change immediately. You can, though, get them to change over the course of many, many years, probably centuries. There's little doubt that in terms of the Torah's value system, the exercise of power by one person over another without their consent is a fundamental assault against human dignity. This is not just true of the relationship between master and slave. It is even true, according to many classic Jewish commentators, of the relationship between king and subjects, rulers and ruled. According to the sages, it is even true of the relationship between God and human beings. The Talmud says that if God really did coerce the Jewish people to accept the Torah by suspending the mountain over their heads, that would constitute an objection to the very terms of the covenant itself. We are God's avadim, servants, only because our ancestors freely chose to be that. So slavery is to be abolished, but it is a fundamental principle of God's relationship with us that it does not force us to change faster then we are able to do so of our own free will. This is, I bolded that because this is the pondering, the meditative line, which is, are we supposed to do things that we really can't do? And if there are certain kinds of things that are embedded in human behavior and human culture, how do you change that? Can you change that radically by saying it's over? Or do you change that gradually? And so what he's saying is that, of course, we would prefer to change it radically, but we can't. So what we do is we change it of our own free will, even if that's slower. Mishpatim, which is the Parsha that deals with this earlier on, does not abolish slavery, but it sets in motion a series of fundamental laws that will lead people, albeit at their own pace, to abolish it of their own accord. Here are the laws. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free. So in other words, like we have in our Parsha this week, the Shemitah, the amnesty or the manumission of slaves in their 7th year. But if the servant declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and do not want to go free, then his master must take him before the judges. He shall take him to the door or the doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Then he will be the servant for life. Sounds, it's very strange. So the point is, it's making it easy for the servant, the slave, has an automatic amnesty in the sabbatical year. But if the servant chooses, the servant can be marked in a way that will be demeaning to the servant, so that the servant will may in the end not choose to be marked that way. What is being done in these laws? First, a fundamental change is taking place in the nature of slavery. No longer is it a permanent status, it is a temporary condition. A Hebrew slave goes free after 7 years. He or she knows this. Liberty awaits the slave, not at the whim of the master, but by divine command. When you know that within a fixed time you are going to be free, you may be a slave in body, but in your own mind, you are a free human being who has temporarily lost his or her liberty. That in itself is revolutionary. This alone, though, was not enough. 6 years are a long time, hence the institution of Shabbat, ordained so that one day in 7, a slave could breathe free air. No one could command him to work. 6 days you shall labor, so that your nor your male servant, female servant, so that your male and female servant may rest. In other words, and you've heard me say this, in discussion about Shabbat, the Bible itself undermines the institution. While slavery is permitted, the Bible rejects it and undermines it by giving the slave the taste of freedom 1 day out of 7, and enabling the slave to say, I like this better, and to enable the slave to find their way to the 7th year, or to another kind of situation which the law enables, to purchase their freedom, to find a way to their freedom. And of course, any injury that the slave incurs automatically grants the slave freedom, both the Hebrew slave and the Canaanite slave. A slave that in the course of servitude loses a limb, God forbid, or other things, or has some kind of debilitating injury, automatically gets his freedom. But the Torah is acutely aware that not every slave wants liberty. This too emerges out of Israelite history. More than once in the wilderness, the Israelites wanted to go back to Egypt. As Rashi points out, the phrase at no cost cannot be understood literally. They paid for it with their labor and their lives. Freedom carries a highest price, namely moral responsibility. Many people have shown what Eric Fromm called fear of freedom. Rousseau spoke of forcing people to be free, a view that led in time to the reign of terror following the French Revolution. The Torah does not force people to be free, but it does insist on a ritual of stigmatization. If a slave refuses to go free, his master shall take him to the door or doorpost and pierce his ear with an awl. Rashi explains, why was the ear chosen to be pierced rather than all other limbs of the body? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said, the ear that heard on Mount Sinai, fear not, for to me the children of Israel are servants. And he nevertheless went ahead and acquired a master for himself, should have his ear pierced. Rabbi Shimon expounded this verse in a beautiful manner. Why are the door and the doorpost different from other objects of the house? God, in effect, has said, the door and doorpost were witnesses in Egypt when I passed over the lintel and the 2 doorposts, and I said, for to me are the children of Israel servants. They are my servants, not servants of servants. And this person went ahead and acquired a master for himself. He shall have his ear pierced in their presence. A slave may stay a slave, but not without being reminded that this is not what God wants for his people. The result of these laws was to create a dynamic that would, in the end, lead to an abolition of slavery at a time of free human choosing. And so it happened. The Quakers, Methodists, Evangelicals, most famous among them, William Wilberforce, who led a campaign in Britain to abolish slave trade, were driven by religious conviction, inspired not the least by the biblical narrative of Exodus and by the challenge of Isaiah to proclaim freedom for captives and for prisoners released from darkness. Slavery was abolished in the United States only after a civil war, but there were those who cited the Bible in defense of slavery. I'm sorry. As Abraham Lincoln put it in the second inauguration, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we not be judged. Yet slavery was abolished in the United States, not least because the affirmation in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and all are endowed by their Creator with inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson, who wrote those words, was himself a slave owner, yet such is the latent power of ideals that eventually people see that by insisting on their right to freedom and dignity while denying it to others, they are living a contradiction. That is when change takes place, and it takes time. If history tells us anything, it is that God has patience, though it is often sorely tried. He wanted slavery abolished, but he wanted it to be done by free human beings, coming to see of their own accord the evil it is and the evil it does. The God of history, who taught us to study history, had faith that eventually we would learn the lesson of history, that freedom is indivisible. We must grant freedom to others if we truly seek it for ourselves. So the question that I'm asking you is whether or not this is at all very satisfying. If history tells us that God has patience, though it is often sorely tried. He wanted slavery abolished, but wanted it to be done by free human beings. I'm going to stop it there and ask the question, really, if that's good, satisfying, or apologetic. And what would be your response to Rabbi Sachs? If you could. But Ilana, go ahead. I have a question. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to mention before you read Rabbi Sachs that in the beginning of the book of Joshua, when Joshua becomes the leader, it says Moshe Eved Hashem, Moshe the slave of God, but Joshua Mesharet Moshe.
Okay.
Joshua is the servant or the server of Moshe.
Yeah.
So the limits are a little confusing for this. Okay, and then I wanted to also mention that when you teach children, young children, about slavery and freedom, there is always this fable about the dog and the wolf. The wolf is asking the dog, why don't you want to be free like me, living in the forest or something? And the dog says, no, it's very convenient for me to stay with a family who give me a house and food. But the wolf does not want to be like this, and he stays in the forest.
Well, I think you raised that. That's a critical issue. Look, it's in political philosophy. How do people, what do people want? And the question as to whether or not people actually want freedom has been debated. We are in a kind of moment where we see around the world where there's so much vulnerability and so much sense of insecurity. People want to be taken care of. So they're ready to sacrifice freedom for the myth that someone is going to take care of them and someone's going to protect them. And that's what you may see in some populistic movements. and political philosophers throughout history understood this, and the Bible understands this, because the Bible already, it frames this in the story that Sachs cites, which is that as soon as the people are free, they start complaining because they have to live, they have to subsist on themselves. And so, God takes care of them for sure. God gives them water, God gives them manna as food, but they want to go back to Egypt almost at every time. They want the luxury of the food in Egypt. It's ridiculous, but when you're suffering like this, you'll take anything for some kind of relief, and that's what's going on there. Okay.
But why is Moses being addressed as Eved, the slave of God, and about Joshua, it's not the
Misharet.
same category. He's the Mesharet Moshe.
Well, I think, yeah, the word Eved again has these two sides of the coin. One is the demeaning side, and one is the dignified side. He is the true Eved Hashem. That is to say, we attain our dignity by being God's servants. That we are imprinted by the infinite value of our lives because we are God's servants. And just the same way that as I mentioned, if you could get that post to be, and if that's what you wanted, and you got to be the king's confidant, right? People want that position because they have the honor, they have a certain dignity in being the servant. So misharet, the word misharet is not Evan. Misharet is kind of a steward to Moses. It's Batman and Robin. Robin is to Batman what Joshua is to Moses, kind of thing. That's the way I look at it. But let me ask Bob. Go ahead, Bob.
So my response to your philosophical question that you asked before is yes, and with an emphasis on the and. I wanted to make a comment and then have a follow-up question. As you were speaking, I was reminded of a thing I read about why do we eat matzah before maror during Passover. And one of the questions was, in order to know what slavery is, you need to taste freedom. And so one of my questions is, did the Israelites know that in fact they were enslaved? And if they didn't, is this whole section that we're reading a part of a psycho-spiritual development of understanding what in fact it is to be a slave, and how does one escape or change a slave mentality? And then that brings me to my quasi-Hasidic question, which is there a difference between material slavery and spiritual slavery? And is this a meditation of part on how we deal with both?
Wow. So on the first question, what do they know? And we'll have to simply imagine what they know, and imagine, growing up, or imagine, the experience of Israelite slavery in the biblical chronology lasts for a few hundred years. So you are born into it and that's what you know. And it's not an accident that African American slavery and lore has that sense. You are born into it, and to a certain extent, we're still suffering from, the vestiges of that, 100 and something years after the Civil War, and the stigma of that, and the sense that still persists, very, very painful. Did they taste freedom before? Did they know freedom before? Well, we don't know. What we can say though is, so the slave in the society gets to taste freedom on a regular basis because the slave gets Shabbat. And you heard me say this, say it again, the fact that the slave gets the taste of freedom on a regular basis undermines slavery. Would Israelite slavery have been total? Would they have worked on Shabbat? Did they ever get any rest? Who knows? I don't know. Do we taste the matzah as freedom before we taste the maror, which is slavery? I don't know. But my whole approach to that is completely different, because you'll forgive me for playing the biblical interpreter card, which is the verse says al matzot umrorim. It says, for you are to eat the paschal lamb al matzot ve'al mrorim. So what in the verse comes first? The bread, the matzot. So that's why you eat the bread first. And the second, which is so I'm not sure that the text here is making the spiritual case. Of course, homiletically, we can take it into all these directions, and that's totally valid. But in the context of the rules of this parsha, these are economic rules and not spiritual, physical. Go ahead, Stanley.
Yeah, so in answer to your question, I find Rabbi Sachs's outlook on this really quite convincing. That is that change often is slow. And I think we all know this, and we see it all the time. And I see it as a psychologist. Sometimes I see people for years in therapy, and the change happens, but it happens very slowly. So I think if the pronouncement had been from God, that's it for slavery, finished, that's no more, it might not have been accepted, and had been going on for a long time. So maybe better was to put guards on it, boundaries on it. And what I think of is the idea that Israel is to be a light unto the nations. So there's a difference between what is set up for requirements for Jewish slaves and for non-Jewish slaves, let's say, so that you start with something, movement in that direction, and Jews then set a moral example, as it were, for others, that this is a direction that you want to be going, even if we can't go entirely in that way right now. It doesn't make it right. I mean, we understand, we all feel sort of morally, disturbed by it, but it's a question of what the trajectory is. And as we've seen, that trajectory, has been somewhat, at least in that direction, although not everywhere. It reminds me a little bit, I don't even know if it's true. Some have said that the Bible really has expected us to be vegetarians, but couldn't pronounce it that way. So instead it put restrictions on what we can eat. And eventually that would be the ultimate, not to kill any creatures. Anyway.
So that's a good example. It's a good example of a behavior that is condoned, meat eating, right, when it's not an ideal. And that would, is the Bible moving you to an ideal? Well, the Bible just it is taking into account human proclivity and saying, okay, look, we know, I know you want to eat meat. If you're going to eat meat, this is the way you do it. A, you have to slaughter it. And B, you have to, A, you have to select it from certain groups, and B, you have to slaughter it so that to remove as much of the blood as possible. And C, when you consume meat, do not consume it with dairy for reasons that won't go into right now. Okay, John.
I have a slightly different view than Stan. I think there was another option than just to say slavery is done. God sort of said it is wrong. It is wrong. And if the idea is to get man over time to change his view, this would be a good way to do it. You're not saying you're not legislating the end of it, but you're taking a position. And I think that option is left out in Rabbi Sachs's discussion. And then one other short point relating to Bob's comment, which I really love, about you once you taste kind of the essence of freedom, you won't abide slavery. De Tocqueville said that in his book on the French Revolution. He said what caused the people to really rise up was when they had a taste of freedom. So the idea carried forward into that great book by de Tocqueville.
So I wish we could ask Jonathan Sacks that question. Couldn't God have said it's wrong? And I'll give you my humble answer, which is, and it's you'll forgive it for the sentimentality that it has. Part of so Abraham has a slave, and Jacob marries two women who are slaves, and Hagar is a slave, a handmaiden. And you don't want to cast aspersions on our founders, even though it's implicit, and even though Abraham trusted his servant, and when we've read those stories, you can see that there's a lot of affection between the two of them, but there's also no question as to who's in charge and who's subordinate to whom. And so, and God doesn't, the Torah doesn't hesitate to say when things are disgusting, reprehensible, abominations. It certainly uses those terms elsewhere on other things. Shouldn't it have used that term here? Thou shalt not have a slave because it's an abomination to me. So we would have loved that, and I think that's the problem. That's precisely the problem, that it doesn't say that. So one excuse is to say, okay, look, it's rooted in its time, and that's fine. Another excuse is to say, look, we have to admit that the Hebrew scriptures have objectionable passages, as all scriptures do, and these are ours, okay? And we'll take our objectionable passages over the objectionable passages in other religions, thank you very much. But it's objectionable. My colleagues have pointed out, when we get to the war against Midian, where it's basically the injunctions for genocide, that's pretty objectionable. And so, yes, we have to come to terms with the fact that as much as we sing to the Torah and enjoy and laud and adore it, it's got problematic passages that work themselves out as this one does. It works itself out because it's answered by the course of Jewish history through interpreters in the rabbinic tradition. And yes, it's we study this precisely to develop the tools to contextualize it and to understand it and to try and take from these things already the seeds of the difficulty. But would it have been better? Probably. But Sacks's point then, which is, well, God is not going to do things for human beings that human beings can't do on their own through their own free will. And so, for God in the biblical worldview, human freedom is so important that even at the consequence of human suffering, to enable human beings to withdraw that freedom from human beings would be catastrophic. Not sure that that's satisfying, but that's one approach here as well. We'll conclude. Nanette, go ahead.
Okay. So I just want to add, not everybody wants human freedom. I can't help thinking about there's a high, maybe not high, but there's definitely an X amount of folks that are incarcerated. They're let out, they're let to go. They don't want to go. They want to go back to the prison because they don't know how to live.
That's a different story. The Shawshank Redemption, one of our favorite movies, has that character. They've been incarcerated their whole lives. They don't know how to function on the outside, and they're willing to have recidivist behavior in order to go back in, and that's a tragedy. That's a great tragedy. And and there's a whole literature on this, by the way, and studies on this, and how and the support that is necessary for people who've been incarcerated. We have so many people like that, and how they need to be served by the societies that they re-enter, because it's just so hard. There is one set of rules inside and one set of rules outside. We have our own experience in Jewish history of the Holocaust and survivors, and of course, the people who survived, they were heroic in their own way, and what we don't have an accurate picture of is how hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people coped in the first months following their liberation, many of whom couldn't handle it, and physically, you have lots of stories of people who just ate too much, and certainly psychologically, what were they going to do? And were it not for the fact that there were refugee camps and displaced person camps and Zionism and people working the highest, etc., and giving people hope, the catastrophe happened, and then the catastrophe of the survivors could have been even that much more complicated. Okay, Steve Parkoff, go ahead.
One last thing,
Yes.
quickly. You got to make a distinction between Joshua and Abraham's servant. They are more chiefs of staff than they are servants.
Yes.
Not servants. And the handmaids who become wives,
Yes.
once they become a wife, they've got full wifely privileges.
Yes.
And they're equal to the other wives. So you got to make that distinction.
Yes. Okay. Point made. I'm obfuscating. It's a 2-minute penalty for obfuscation, for blurring the lines. Go ahead, Ilana. Yes.
Eliezer had full authority from Abraham to negotiate, right?
Yes. It wasn't a slow. Go ahead, Ilana. Go ahead. Sorry.
So again, when you teach children about freedom and slavery, many of them say, aren't we all slaves in life? We are slaves to school rules, to family rules, to society rules. We actually don't really live in a free world, in a way.
Yes, this is it's a great conversation to have, and to understand this, and of course, to relativize suffering is very, very complicated and difficult. We tend to do that, but the anguish that some people may feel emotionally is very real to them. But one of the things that I'm sure you as a teacher taught children was we all have responsibilities in life, and it's because we have responsibilities that we are able to enjoy things. And so what you see as something like enslavement is that's your responsibility. You don't get, as a child, you don't get to do the things that you want to do precisely because you're not in control. And there's a reason why you're not in control. It has to do with your safety, security, and your ability. And one day you will. So your childhood is the training for your responsibility. I think that that is generally the message when the response, which is, yeah, of course you're not free, but you're learning how to be free, and we're modeling that to you, and we want you to be free in the sense that you are able to make choices and be responsible in all of the choices that you make, because you will discover that, yes, having freedom means having a lot of choices, and that having those choices means that you can choose sometimes very unwisely as well. All right, we'll leave it there. And thank you so much. We'll see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi.
Yasha Koa.
Thank
Have
you.
a good week, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.